there is a particular quiet that settles over a realm at its height, a quiet that does not come from stillness so much as from the steady hum of things that seem to be working, the roads busy with carts and couriers, the treasuries balanced and counted, the ministries sending neat instructions to provinces far away, while in the capital the lamps burn late and the court is composed and confident. And yet, beneath all of this gentle order, there moves a softer, older current, a feeling that the wide circle has reached its widest point and is beginning, almost imperceptibly, to turn back toward itself. By 1810 and the years just beyond, the empire of Napoleon Bonaparte felt like that quiet, handsome on the surface, efficient in its routines, and admired by many for the energy and intelligence that had brought it into being. And yet, as with all great constructions, carrying within it the faint shadow of its own limits. From Paris outward, the map appeared to glow with intention. Laws were uniform, where once they had been tangled and local, the Code Civil giving shape to property and family and contract in a way that merchants and magistrates appreciated for its clarity. Bridges and roads and canals were mended and newly built, making the distances across France and into neighboring lands feel shorter. The post arriving in regular rhythms, the market towns humming at dawn as bales and barrels were unloaded, receipts signed, and ledgers closed with tidy columns of figures. Schools trained administrators, academies trained officers, prefects sent their bulletins to the center and received, in turn, the center's calm replies. Even the currency felt steadier in the hand. After the noise and keening uncertainty of the revolutionary years, these were comforts, and people felt them as one feels a steady hand placed gently on a shoulder. In the great city itself, Paris wore its confidence with a kind of restrained elegance. Boulevards were busier but not riotous. Cafes were talkative but not dangerous. The theatres filled in the evenings with audiences that came for diversion and left with the pleasant sensation that life under rules and routine, even when rules were strict, could be good. Processions were carefully arranged, receptions sounded with measured music, and there was the quiet knowledge that the man who presided over it all began work before others woke, and was often still writing, still reading, still deciding, after the last carriages rattled home. He was everywhere in symbols, and nowhere in idle rumour, a presence that made some people feel safe and others feel watched, but in either case suggested that France had a single, unwavering centre of gravity. Beyond France, the map looked like a great fabric pulled taut. Kingdoms and duchies held by allies or family, sister republics now turned to client states, territories reorganized to fit a rational grid of departments and codes, and along the frontiers a belt of strength, fortresses supplied, garrisons inspected, generals moving with precise orders in sealed packets. Across the Rhine and the Alps, across the Pyrenees and into the Low Countries, there seemed no part of the continent untouched by the logic of Paris. A traveller moving along those roads would find customs houses staffed by officials with standardized forms, courtrooms with judges applying the same laws, engineers laying out canals by familiar measurements, and, everywhere, the sense that the age of hesitant compromise and local accident had been replaced by an age of design. And yet even in that brightness, there were shadows that lengthened slowly, the way afternoon light draws out the smallest unevenness of a field. The first was the simple truth that order across such distances asks for constant attention, and attention is a human thing with human limits. A decree written with economy in the Tuileries could, by the time it reached a town beyond the mountains or a port at the far edge of a gulf, pass through hands that were tired or cautious or quietly resistant, and what had been clear in Paris became, somewhere along the way, a little less clear. A tax that seemed measured at the center could feel heavy at the margin. A levy for conscripts that looked like arithmetic in a ledger could, inside a farmhouse where a boy folded his work shirt for the last time, feel like subtraction from the very core of a family. Paper order and human feeling do not always meet in harmony, and the small space between them is where quiet doubts begin to gather. There was another shadow, softer still and perhaps more inescapable, the way success creates needs that resemble the causes of that success. Victories had made the empire strong, and strength required the posture of readiness. Readiness demanded armies, and armies demanded men, food, horses, gunpowder, boots, uniforms, remounts, wagons, and coin. Coin demanded taxes and trade, interfered with by a sea that would not yield, demanded new rules that pulled at old habits. The continental system, this attempt to close Europe's markets against Britain as one closes a gate against a steady wind, was logical in its intention and harsh in its effect. And in towns that had always known the sea as a friend, it made shopkeepers and sailors and clerks feel the pinch that distant policy can place upon local life. Smugglers found quiet creeks, officials became suspicious, small resentments piled up like driftwood after a storm. Still, the center held, and perhaps that was its truest strength. There was a mind at the heart of it all that loved to put things in order, that could turn a confused situation into a clear one with a few strokes of the pen, that saw every delay as a problem to be dissolved by clarity. Ministers learned to present questions not only in words, but in carefully arranged facts. Generals learned that reports should be precise. Prefects learned that their letters would be read in detail, and everyone learned that the answer would come back quickly. It is soothing after chaos to be governed by attention. It is also tiring for the governor to attend to all things at once. When the empire was quietest, the emperor himself did not sleep much. He moved through rooms cooled by high ceilings and shaded curtains, working at a desk that gathered documents like a harbor gathers ships, and he thought of frontiers in the same breath with the price of wheat, of the oath of a new prince in the same line with a plan for a road across a mountain pass, and then, without pause, of a design for a lyceum in a provincial city where, in a few years, boys would learn geometry and Latin and the feeling of a life larger than their village. There is a steadiness in such thought, and a loneliness as well, for it composes a world and must carry the weight of keeping it composed. In the salons and drawing rooms, voices were softer than they had once been, more careful, but they still measured out their observations. how marriage had connected the empire to old Europe, how titles sat upon the shoulders of men whose merit had made them, how the old nobility and the new meritocracy smiled at one another across card tables and supper tables, slowly learning the shared language of compromise. In the army mess tents, the talk was more direct. There had been glory, there would be more glory, and there would be marches and bivouacs, and always the sense that when orders came they would be precise, and that if they were carried out with precision, the machinery of victory would turn as it had always turned. Veterans spoke gently to younger men about the usefulness of dry socks and coffee before dawn, about the art of folding a cloak to keep the ground's cold away, about how a map looks different when the rain has turned the road to clay. Quietly, though, the empire's edges were learning their own lessons. In the Iberian hills, where towns sat on ridges and streets climbed like stairways, the day did not accept order easily from far-off hands. The countryside listened more attentively to its priests than to a prefect's circular, and families measured time by harvests and saints' days, not by Parisian calendars. Where law arrives with a foreign accent, it can feel like an imposition, however reasonable its clauses may be. And resistance, even when small and local, has a way of unsettling the sleep of distant rulers. A convoy delayed here, a patrol waylaid there, a message that does not arrive, a rumor that grows into something harder than rumor. These are the first hints, and they do not look like crises until the ledger of them is read in a single column. To the east, beyond rivers that run wide in spring and freeze hard in winter, there lay the impression of silence, of long distances that seem to absorb intention and give back only the sound of wind in trees and sleigh runners on hard snow. Diplomacy tried to arrange this wide quiet into agreements and marriages and polite sentences, and for a time the arrangement held, but beneath it lived colder truths about pride and space and the awkwardness of sharing influence over the middle of the continent. Even when portraits were exchanged and toasts were made, even when embassies submitted their regular reports that nothing had changed, there was the feeling, faint at first, then less faint, that the map could not bear two centers of gravity forever. At home, mothers whose eldest sons had gone off in earlier campaigns watched their younger sons grow strong enough for the sergeant's measuring stick, and their pride and fear lived side by side. Farmers counted how many hands would be left to bring in the wheat. Artisans wondered whether the next contract would be for uniforms or for something gentler. Prefects wrote that quotas were met, and sometimes wrote that they would be met tomorrow. The machinery continued to turn. It always turns until it does not. In these years, the emperor's gaze did not waver, his pen did not slow. He believed, as one believes in the logic of a bridge one has designed, that if each arch is sound and each stone properly placed, the span will hold across whatever water runs below. The empire to him was a span of that sort, provinces bound by law, allies bound by interest, enemies bound by respect, and the whole kept together by vigilance. He felt the necessity of firmness, not as a preference, but as a duty, and duty carried him forward in the same way it had carried him up icy passes and across smoky fields. If there were murmurs in distant parishes, then administration must be sharper. If there were ships blockading harbours, then commerce must seek new roads. If there were officers who doubted, then new officers must be made from men who did not. In all of this, there was courage, the same quiet courage that rises before daylight and works until midnight. And there was also the narrowness that courage sometimes brings, the conviction that the next motion, the next stroke, must surely be the one that completes the design. The shadow within an empire at its height is not a storm cloud that rushes in. It is more like the lengthening of evening, barely noticed at first because the day is still warm and the work still seems to be getting done. A small delay in a port becomes a habit of delay. A handful of villages that will not be governed become a district that must be governed by soldiers. A promise made to reassure an ally must be kept at a cost that was not in the first calculation. And a timetable that could be met only with perfect weather begins to falter when the weather, as weather will, refuses to obey timetables. Yet nothing in this moment felt like collapse. The armies were still formidable, the treasuries still adequate, the ministries still exacting. The emperor still rode out to reviews where ranks glittered and drums carried a steady heartbeat across open fields, and he still returned to rooms where maps lay rolled beside neat stacks of correspondence. He looked, to those who saw him, like a man managing a vast estate with a mixture of affection and severity, loving its order and its promise, unwilling to yield a single corner of it to disorder. It is possible at such a height to love control so much that one cannot see the small movements at the edges for what they are. Not affronts to be corrected, but warnings to be read. And because he had built so much by correcting, he turned, as he always had, to correction. It would be done as it had always been done, with attention, with speed, with an insistence that clarity prevails over confusion. The orders went out. The columns formed. The lists were made and sent and updated. The bridges would be crossed, the towns pacified, the allies steadied, the distant empire coaxed or compelled into proper alignment. But the world, with its weather and its hearts, has a way of answering even the most careful designs with its own designs. And somewhere in that answer, which began like a whisper along coasts and in hills and across frost-bound plains, the shadow within the empire grew just a little longer, enough for those who looked carefully to wonder, not loudly, not yet, but in themselves, whether the next campaign would be like the last, whether the road ahead was as smooth as the map suggested, and whether the very steadiness that had saved France might now be carrying it toward a place where steadiness alone would not be enough. For tonight, though, we leave the empire in that delicate balance, its laws bright, its roads busy, its drums precise, its master tireless, and we let the listener rest with the soft knowledge that even at the pinnacle, history moves gently, turning inch by inch, the way the light moves across a room at day's end, preparing without hurry and without alarm the long evening to come. There are moments in history when what seems small at the beginning begins to widen, quietly, until it becomes something vast, a shadow that spreads across years and nations, slow and unrelenting. For Napoleon and his empire, Spain was such a shadow. It began almost invisibly, a matter of policy, a problem of trade and allegiance, but it would grow into a slow undoing, not through a single great defeat, but through exhaustion, resistance, and the steady erosion of control. Spain had been both ally and rival to France, tied by treaties and uneasy trust. The Spanish king, Charles IV, ruled a land of old rituals and divided loyalties. His court was filled with whispers of weak leadership, of corruption, of the influence of Manuel Godoy, the favorite minister who seemed to govern more by charm than competence. Unto Napoleon, the weakness of Spain was both opportunity and risk. He looked at the map of Europe and saw not simply borders, but the flow of influence, trade, and threat. The British Navy, unchallenged at sea, used Portugal and Spanish ports to move goods and gold. Their ships slipped along the coasts, defying his continental system, which sought to choke England's commerce by closing Europe to British goods. The logic was clear to him. If Spain and Portugal could be brought firmly under French control, the blockade would hold, and the empire's economic order would be secure. But logic, in the affairs of nations, is rarely enough. In 1807, France and Spain signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau, an agreement that allowed French troops to cross Spain on their way to occupy Portugal. To the Spanish people, it seemed at first a practical alliance. French columns marched across their lands, disciplined, confident, polite. They bought bread and wine, they paid with coin, they saluted priests and town officials. But there was something in their silence, something in their numbers, that unsettled the countryside. And when Portugal fell, the French did not leave. More troops followed, more supplies, more officers issuing orders. The sense of partnership began to feel more like occupation. In Madrid, the royal family faltered under pressure. Quarrels within the palace spilled into the streets. The Spanish people, long patient, began to murmur. In 1808, in the small town of Bayonne, under the guise of diplomacy, Napoleon persuaded both Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to abdicate, replacing them with his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. It was a bloodless transfer on paper, another neat rearrangement of power, but it touched something deep and ancient in the Spanish heart. Kings might be weak, priests might quarrel, but foreign rule, however clever its disguise, was an affront. The anger began not with armies, but with voices, shouts in markets, sermons from pulpits, whispers in taverns. Then came stones thrown at patrols, knives drawn in alleys, and soon the streets of Madrid erupted. On the 2nd of May 1808, the people rose, uncoordinated but furious. And soldiers fired into crowds, citizens fought with whatever they had, tools, bottles, paving stones. It was chaos, raw and sudden, the kind of uprising that no general's plan can predict or prevent. The rebellion was crushed by evening, and those captured were executed the next day. But the sound of the gunfire did not end in Madrid. It echoed outward, through villages and valleys into the mountains. Spain had awakened. In the months that followed, revolt spread like a brush fire. Towns declared themselves free of French control, priests blessed militias, and small bands of fighters began to appear in the hills. They were not armies, at least not in the organized sense. They were farmers, herders, and blacksmiths, men who knew their land better than any map could show, men who could vanish into the rocks and forests, strike a convoy, and disappear again before pursuit could even begin. They called themselves guerrilleros, little warriors, and from their name came a new word, guerrilla, a way of fighting that was not a battle, but a constant bleeding of strength. Napoleon, far away, saw only the reports. He read of victories, the capture of cities, the dispersal of rebels, but also of ambushes, of supply lines cut, of small, stubborn towns that would not yield. The generals he sent were skilled, but they fought against something that could not be pinned down. Each valley reclaimed was lost again, each success undone by another uprising. What had seemed a simple occupation became an endless maintenance of order, one that demanded more troops, more money, more attention. And always, beyond the mountains, the British waited. Under the steady command of Arthur Wellesley, the man who would one day be called the Duke of Wellington, British forces landed in Portugal and began to move east. They brought supplies, discipline, and patience. The guerrillas welcomed them as allies, guiding them, feeding them, sharing their knowledge of the terrain. The British Army, methodical and calm, was everything the French were not expecting, cautious but relentless, advancing not in glory but in endurance. The war in Spain dragged on year after year. It was not the kind of war Napoleon understood. No grand maneuvers, no decisive battles, no elegant strategies of encirclement. It was instead a slow, wearing conflict of attrition. Each victory felt smaller, each defeat heavier. The marshals wrote home about courage, but also about frustration. Villages burned, roads unsafe, men worn thin by constant marching and ambush. At first, Napoleon tried to manage the campaign from afar, sending reinforcements, replacing commanders, demanding progress. But as the years passed, even he began to see that Spain was not a battlefield to be conquered, but a wound that would not close. It consumed soldiers faster than victories could replace them. It drained morale, stretched resources, and turned allies into doubters. The empire that had once moved like a single organism now began to feel the strain in its limbs. By 1812, as he turned his gaze toward Russia, Spain remained unsettled, occupied yet ungoverned. Joseph Bonaparte still sat on the throne in Madrid, but his rule reached little beyond the city's outskirts. The countryside belonged to no one. The French armies there were ghosts of their former strength, exhausted and scattered, holding territory that gave them nothing but trouble in return. And through it all the people endured, stubborn, resilient, unbroken. In their struggle, the empire discovered something it had not yet met, a resistance that could not be measured in lines of battle or in treaties signed. The Spanish War was a teacher of humility, though its lessons would come too late to be heeded. What began as an act of calculation, a correction of geography and policy, had become a slow, quiet undoing. The empire, stretched across too many lands, now faced an enemy it could neither fully defeat nor fully understand. And in the long, weary nights of campaign tents, French officers would sometimes look toward the hills and see the small fires of the guerrillas glowing in the distance, like stars that refused to go out. And perhaps, in the calm before sleep, they wondered if this land, so proud and unyielding, was whispering to them of the future, of what happens when ambition meets endurance, and the earth itself refuses to be conquered. By the spring of 1812, Europe seemed to lie beneath the calm of empire. From the Atlantic to the edges of Poland, the roads carried French orders, French goods, French law. The map was drawn in the emperor's design, precise, confident, vast. And yet, in the stillness that comes before great storms, there was already tension in the air, a quiet that did not comfort, but waited. The alliance between Napoleon and Russia, sealed years before with treaties and polite words, had grown brittle. To the east, Tsar Alexander V watched the spread of French influence with unease, seeing in every new province a shadow reaching closer to his borders. The continental system, Napoleon's grand attempt to close all Europe to British trade, had become a burden that even allies could not long bear. For Russia, whose wealth flowed through its ports and grain markets, the blockade felt like a chain. The Tsar began to turn away from it, allowing British ships to dock once more. Napoleon, who had spent his life believing that will could bend the world, saw this as a betrayal not of friendship but of order itself. In his mind, the map must hold, the system must function, and the currents of trade and allegiance must flow where he directed them. If they did not, they would be corrected, and as they always had been, went with clarity and speed. And so he began to plan. In May of that year, the greatest army Europe had ever seen began to gather. It was called the Grande Armée, the Grand Army, and it was indeed immense, more than 500,000 men, drawn from every corner of the empire and its allies. And French, Polish, German, Italian, Dutch, an empire in motion. Horses were shod, wagons built, cannon polished until they gleamed. Supply officers counted flour and salt, boots and bullets, as if numbers alone could guarantee success. In the first warmth of summer, they began to move east. Columns of soldiers stretched across the roads for miles, the air shimmering above their ranks, drums beating a slow, confident rhythm. To the men, it felt like another campaign, another demonstration of the emperor's invincibility. To Napoleon, it was a march toward discipline, a correction of disobedience, not a war of conquest. In June, they crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. Napoleon, riding to the center of the bridge, paused, raised his hand and said quietly, "The war has begun." His officers cheered, but he was silent. Ahead lay forests, rivers, and plains that seemed endless, a landscape too vast to be contained by any plan. The Russian armies, under Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, did not meet them head-on. Instead, they fell back mile by mile, deeper into their own land, burning supplies as they went. The French advanced, but each step took them further from home, from food, from familiar ground. Villages stood empty, fields blackened by fire, wells poisoned, bridges broken. The soldiers marched through silence and smoke. Napoleon had built his victories on movement, the quick strike, the encirclement, the decisive blow that ended wars before they could truly begin. But here in Russia, there was nothing to strike. Each battle that seemed promised dissolved into retreat. The enemy would appear in the distance, then vanish. Maps, so precise in Europe, became meaningless in this land of endless forests and shifting rivers. Summer burned into heat and dust. The men marched under the sun until their uniforms turned pale with sweat and their boots split at the seams. Horses collapsed, wagons broke. Still they went forward, always forward, following the emperor's belief that the next day, the next victory, would bring the end. At Smolensk, they fought and won, but the victory gave no rest. The city was taken, but it was also in ruins. Empty streets, smoldering houses, the smell of smoke and iron. "They will not fight," Napoleon said quietly, "but they will not yield either." The army pressed on. In September, near a small village called Borodino, the Russians finally turned to fight. The battlefield stretched wide under a grey sky. The air was thick with the sound of cannon, with the heavy rhythm of artillery rolling forward. The fighting was brutal and close, men clashing at distances so near they could feel one another's breath. The French took the field, but at a terrible cost, tens of thousands dead or wounded. The Russians withdrew again, their army battered but unbroken. Napoleon, standing amid the smoke, looked out over the wreckage and said only, "The most terrible of all my battles," and yet no result. A week later, the French reached Moscow. They expected surrender, peace, perhaps negotiation. Instead, they found silence. The city was nearly deserted. Then one night, as the wind rose, fires began to spread. Flames leapt from roof to roof, fanned by the dry air. Within hours, much of Moscow was burning, the great capital of Russia turning to ash before their eyes. Whether by accident or by design, the message was the same: nothing would be given. Napoleon waited for word from the Tsar. None came. He waited for supplies. They dwindled. The nights grew colder. The golden light of autumn gave way to the white breath of winter. Snow began to fall, softly at first, then endlessly. The roads became rivers of ice. Horses stumbled and fell. Wagons froze in place. Food ran out, then firewood, then hope. At last, with the frost deepening and no peace in sight, the emperor gave the order to retreat. The Grande Armée turned back the way it had come, but it was no longer grand. The same roads they had marched so proudly now became paths of suffering. Men collapsed in the snow, too weak to rise. Frostbite blackened their hands and faces. The cold cracked muskets and split the bark of trees. Of the 500,000 who had crossed into Russia, only a fraction would return. Some froze, some starved, some were taken prisoner. The mighty army that had carried the weight of an empire dissolved into silence on the frozen plains. Napoleon himself left the column and rode ahead to Paris, his mind already turning to what must be rebuilt. He had lost an army, but he did not yet believe he had lost the war. It was the frost that defeated us, he told his officers, not the Russians. But in truth it was something deeper, the limits of ambition, the refusal of nature and will alike to bend beyond endurance. When he reached the Niemen River again, he paused once more. The river was frozen now, the air sharp and colorless. Behind him, the snow stretched white and endless. Ahead lay the long road home. In the quiet of that crossing, the empire itself seemed to draw breath, a deep, uncertain breath before the long exhale that would follow. The march into Russia had begun with confidence, with the rhythm of drums and boots and banners. It ended with footsteps in snow, muffled and uneven, fading into the wind. And somewhere, beyond the forests and the frost, Europe listened. The world that had once trembled at the sound of French cannon now waited in stillness, knowing that the moment had come when even the greatest designs must face their reckoning. When the decision was finally made to leave Moscow, the city lay in ruins. The wind carried the smell of ash through its empty streets, and the echo of footsteps was swallowed by silence. What had once been a city of bells and domes and markets had become a hollow shell, walls standing without purpose, houses stripped bare for firewood. The soldiers who still remained were thin, their uniforms torn, their faces marked by weariness. The promise of glory that had led them east was gone, replaced by a single simple thought: home. It was October of 1812, and the cold had already begun to settle, not yet the sharp frost of December, but a deep chill that lingered in the bones. Napoleon waited longer than he should have, hoping for peace, for a message from the Tsar, for some word that might make retreat unnecessary. But the Tsar did not answer, and the silence of Russia was as vast and impersonal as its plains. When the order finally came, the Grande Armée turned westward. They left Moscow as they had entered it, in long, disciplined lines, but it was a different kind of discipline now, the discipline of endurance rather than strength. The roads were clogged with wagons carrying wounded men and broken equipment. Horses stumbled under loads too heavy for their ribs, their hooves slipping on frost. Drums no longer beat in rhythm. They were packed away, useless in a march that had no pride left in it. At first, the weather seemed merciful. The days were cold, but the snow held off, and the men believed they could make it back to Smolensk before winter truly came. They sang sometimes, quietly as they walked, songs of home, of wives, of fields in spring. But then, one morning the sky turned white and snow began to fall. It was light at first, drifting lazily through the air, and some even welcomed it, for it softened the landscape and covered the scars of war. But as the days passed, the snow grew heavier. It began to cling to boots and coats, to bury the wagons, to fill the air until sight itself was lost. The march slowed. The men wrapped their scarves tighter, pulled their shakos low against the wind. The temperature dropped further each night. Campfires, once cheerful, became small and desperate things, circles of flickering light surrounded by endless dark. Food ran short. The horses began to die, one by one, and soon the soldiers were cutting strips of frozen flesh from their carcasses just to stay alive. The frost crept into everything, into the barrels of muskets, into the leather of boots, into the lungs of those who breathed too deeply. Fingers blackened, faces turned white with frostbite. And still they marched, because to stop was to die. Behind them, the Russian army followed, not closely but steadily, like a shadow that never tires. Cossack riders appeared on the horizon, striking at stragglers, vanishing again into the snow. The French rear guard fought skirmishes almost daily, brief flashes of gunfire in the blinding cold. The sound of cannon became dull, muffled by snowdrifts. It was not a war now, but a slow, grinding collapse. In the towns they passed, or what was left of them, they found nothing. The Russians had burned or emptied everything before retreating. The soldiers tore apart wooden houses for fuel, set fires that burned too hot, then died too soon. At night, the wind howled through the ruins, and those who survived huddled close together, sharing what warmth they could. Napoleon rode with the column, silent, wrapped in his cloak. He spoke little, though his eyes missed nothing. Each morning reports came. How many men had fallen behind, how many wagons lost, how many cannon abandoned. He listened, nodded, said, "Continue," and the army continued. His presence even now held power. Men who could not walk for themselves still whispered his name with reverence. They believed that if he lived, some part of them might live too. But even the emperor could not command the cold. At the Berezina River in late November, the army reached a crossing point, a wide frozen span of water, its banks lined with snow and ice. On the far side, salvation, on this side, ruin. The bridges had been destroyed. Engineers worked day and night, building new ones out of whatever materials they could find. The river flowed dark beneath them, freezing around the edges, and from the forests beyond came the distant thunder of Russian guns. When the crossing began, it was chaos. Men pressing forward, wagons jamming the approaches, cannon wheels breaking through the ice. Those who fell into the river were lost instantly. Yet somehow, through exhaustion and courage and the sheer instinct to survive, most made it across. Behind them, the bridges were set ablaze, their flames casting a dull red glow over the snow, the last defiance of an army that had once ruled Europe. After the Berezina, the retreat continued in fragments. No longer an army, but a procession of survivors, men without ranks, uniforms in tatters, their rifles long discarded. They no longer marched, they drifted. Some fell asleep in the snow and never woke. Others walked on without speaking, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the west. When Napoleon reached Vilnius, what remained of the Grande Armée was scarcely a shadow of what it had been. Of the 500,000 who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 50,000 were left. The emperor knew then what he had perhaps refused to see before, that will alone cannot command nature, that ambition, when stretched too far, can dissolve in silence rather than in defeat. He stayed in Vilnius only briefly. News from Paris was urgent. Political unrest, rumors, uncertainty. He left the army in the hands of his generals and began the long, solitary journey back to France. The carriage moved quietly through the snow, the sound of its wheels muffled by drifts. Behind him, the road to Moscow was littered with the remnants of his dream, broken muskets, torn flags, and the footprints of men who had believed they were invincible. The soldiers who survived would later speak of the retreat, not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of awe. They said the cold had been beyond imagination, the suffering beyond words, but that, in the midst of it all, there had been moments of stillness, the sight of stars burning clear through the frozen air, the sound of snow falling in forests untouched by war, the small kindnesses of comrades sharing their last crust of bread. It was as though, in losing everything, they had glimpsed something eternal, the humbling truth that even the greatest empire, even the most brilliant mind, must bow before the quiet endurance of the earth. And when they finally crossed back into friendly territory, they did not cheer. They did not speak. They simply kept walking, step after step, through the snow that swallowed their footprints as quickly as they made them, as if the land itself wished to erase the memory of their passing. When the snows of Russia melted in the spring of 1813, they left behind a continent changed. Across the fields and roads of Eastern Europe lay the remnants of the Grande Armée, broken wagons, scattered weapons, and the memory of men who had vanished into frost and silence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Napoleon's name no longer carried certainty. His aura of invincibility, so carefully built, had cracked. It was not destroyed yet, but the sound of that crack carried far. From the cold plains of Poland to the courts of Vienna and London, the old monarchies began to stir. They had watched him dominate Europe for years, watched their armies defeated and their treaties rewritten in his language. Now they sensed a moment of weakness, not collapse, not yet, but vulnerability. And in that moment, old rivals remembered one another. Russia was the first to move. Tsar Alexander, who had once ridden beside Napoleon at Tilsit, now rode against him, his armies moving west in quiet, relentless pursuit. Prussia followed, a nation humiliated and divided since Jena, now awakening with a sudden, almost feverish desire for revenge. Austria, hesitant and cautious, watched for a time, unsure whether to side with its son-in-law or its former allies. Britain, steady as always, send gold and supplies, financing the new coalition as it had so many times before. The storm gathered slowly, but once begun, it grew with purpose. In the spring of that year, the Sixth Coalition was formed. Russia, Prussia, Britain, later Austria, Sweden, and smaller states. An alliance not of conquest, but of survival. Their armies marched with one aim: to bring balance back to Europe, to break the circle that had held them captive for so long. Napoleon, in Paris once more, refused to see the end as inevitable. His body was thinner, his face drawn, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. "I need men," he said simply. France would provide them. He reorganized, he recruited, he drafted new conscripts barely old enough to shave. Muskets were cleaned, uniforms refitted, drums beaten once again. The empire, even wounded, could still rise with astonishing speed. By April, he had raised an army of more than 200,000, young, untested, but loyal. The veterans were gone, buried in Russian snow, but their places were filled by boys who believed the stories of past glories. "The Emperor is with us," they said, and in that belief there was still power. When Napoleon took the field again, he was not the same man who had once swept through Italy or crossed the Alps. The quick confidence remained, but now there was something quieter beneath it, a kind of urgency, perhaps even fatigue. He no longer sought greatness, he sought restoration. He wanted to bring back what had been lost: order, peace, control. Yet history, once it begins to turn, rarely turns backward. In the plains of Saxony, he won again, at Lützen, at Bautzen, swift victories that reminded the world of who he was. His tactics were still brilliant, his timing still exact. The Allies retreated, reorganized, and came again, slower but stronger. It was as though he were fighting not men, but the tide itself, pushing it back only to see it return, heavier, more patient. France, meanwhile, was weary. The fields that once gave soldiers now gave widows. The treasury that once glittered now felt the weight of emptiness. Mothers watched their sons leave in uniforms that no longer fit properly, sewn too quickly, buttons mismatched. Still, they went, because the empire had become not just a government, but a habit of belief. To fight for Napoleon was to fight for France, and to stop fighting was to admit that the years of triumph had come to nothing. In August, Austria joined the coalition. The circle was complete. On Europe, once divided by fear of him, was now united by weariness of him. Napoleon faced enemies on every border, their armies larger than his, their resources deeper, their patience greater. Yet even then he would not yield. He spoke of maneuver, of opportunity, of striking one decisive blow that would restore his dominance. "The situation is serious," he admitted, "but not desperate." It was always not desperate, not yet, not while his mind could still move faster than the map. The decisive blow came, or tried to, at Leipzig in October, the Battle of Nations. There, for 4 days, the armies of Europe converged upon him. More than 500,000 men, their drums and banners filling the fields as far as the eye could see. Napoleon fought as he always had, directing from the center, calm amid the roar of cannon, issuing orders with the precision of a clockmaker. His men fought bravely, but their numbers were too few, their spirit too thin. And bridges collapsed under retreating soldiers, rivers clogged with men and horses, and still the enemy advanced. When the smoke cleared, Napoleon had lost not only the battle, but the confidence of his allies and the hope of victory. The retreat westward began again, slower, heavier. Germany was lost. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved. Kingdoms that had once sent him tribute now turned their flags against him. Europe, long reshaped in his image, was slowly reshaping itself again. By the winter of 1813, he was back on French soil, smaller in scope, but still immense in will. The Allies were closing in, their armies crossing the frontiers. Yet even then, France rallied. The countryside still answered his call. Old soldiers came out of retirement, boys picked up rifles too heavy for their shoulders, and Napoleon, ever the strategist, fought them with skill that bordered on defiance. It was said that in those last campaigns on French soil, he was never more brilliant, moving his forces with impossible speed, striking where he was least expected, defeating larger armies in small, sharp battles. But brilliance could no longer save him. The enemy had learned patience. They moved like slow water, encircling, suffocating, never letting go. And so the war came home. Foreign soldiers marched through the villages of France, past orchards bare from winter, past churches where candles still burned for sons who would not return. In Paris, people spoke softly now, afraid not of arrest but of uncertainty, the first fear that follows the collapse of certainty. Napoleon rode still, tireless, his cloak pulled close against the rain, his eyes watching the horizon for a chance that would not come. "I am one man against Europe," he said once, half in pride, half in wonder. And it was true. The gates had closed. The empire that had stretched across nations was now reduced to its own soil, its leader fighting not for expansion, but for survival. But even surrounded, he did not surrender his composure. His dispatches remained crisp, his handwriting clear. His mind, even when his body faltered, still drew the lines of battle as though logic itself might save him. Perhaps he believed it could. Perhaps he believed that one more victory, just one, might open the door again. Outside, though, the world had changed. The snow fell softly across the French countryside, covering the fields that had once echoed with cannon fire. And in that silence, Europe gathered at the threshold. The gates were no longer his to hold. By the autumn of 1813, the rhythm of war that had once carried Napoleon across Europe had begun to slow. The drums still beat, but their sound no longer echoed with triumph. France was smaller now, the empire thinner, its edges fraying. Yet even as the world closed in around him, the emperor remained calm. His armies still moved at his command, and his mind, sharp, deliberate, unwavering, still sought the one maneuver, the one flawless strike that could turn everything back again. Leipzig was not the battle he wanted, but it was the one that history had prepared for him. The city sat in the heart of Saxony, surrounded by flat fields and quiet rivers, by villages whose names would soon be written into the long scroll of his campaigns. It was there in October that the tide of Europe gathered, hundreds of thousands of men from every corner of the continent, drawn together not by friendship, but by fatigue. They had been conquered once, some twice, and now they had come to end the long shadow of the French Empire. The air was cold, the days short, and the fields damp from rain. Autumn leaves clung to the trees like gold against the grey sky. In the French camp, soldiers patched their boots, mended uniforms, and talked quietly of home. They knew the odds. Reports whispered of nearly 500,000 Allied troops, Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes, arrayed against perhaps 200,000 French and their remaining allies. Yet still they believed in him. Even diminished, even exhausted, Napoleon's presence carried weight. He had led them across mountains, through deserts, through snow, and though their faith was tired, it was not yet broken. On the morning of October 16th, the first cannon sounded across the mist. The earth trembled with the answering roar. The Battle of Leipzig had begun. For 3 days, the fields became a storm of sound and smoke. Villages burned and were fought over again and again. The air was thick with the smell of powder and rain-soaked mud. Horses stumbled in churned earth. Men slipped and fell, their cries lost beneath the constant thunder of guns. It was battle on a scale Europe had never seen. Not one army against another, but a world colliding with itself. From his command post near the city, Napoleon watched through his glass, his cloak drawn close against the cold. He could see little, only the flashes of artillery, the movement of standards through the haze, but his mind assembled what his eyes could not. He issued orders, calm and quick, his voice steady. Even surrounded, even outnumbered, he found patterns within the chaos. And for a while it seemed he might still prevail. On the first day, the French lines held. At Wachau and Liebertwolkwitz, his marshals fought fiercely, driving back the enemy at bayonet's length. The old energy returned for a moment, the swift calculations, the perfect timing, the way he could turn disadvantage into balance with a single decision. His men cheered when reinforcements arrived. Hope flickered. But it was brief, and it burned out quickly. By the second day, the weight of numbers began to show. The coalition armies advanced from every direction, Russian columns from the east, Austrians from the south, Prussians from the north. The French position became a shrinking island amid a sea of enemies. The emperor rode along the lines, his horse spattered with mud, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. He spoke softly to the soldiers, as he always had, with the same measured calm that steadied them when fear threatened to rise. "Hold," he said, "we will endure the storm. they did hold for a time. Villages changed hands 4-5 times in a single afternoon. The ground itself seemed to tremble from the endless cannon fire. Smoke drifted low, turning daylight into twilight. The cries of the wounded mingled with the distant sound of church bells from Leipzig, a haunting reminder that beyond the noise of war, life still went on. On the third day, the balance broke. Ammunition ran low, reinforcements failed to arrive. One by one, his German allies began to falter. And some even turned, Saxon troops, once loyal, suddenly firing upon the French in the middle of battle. It was a moment of betrayal so sudden that even Napoleon, who prided himself on seeing everything, was stunned into silence. The bridges that were meant to secure his retreat became choked with wagons and wounded men. By the evening of October 18th, he knew the truth. The battle was lost. The Empire's reach had stretched too far, its strength drained in too many directions. Still, he would not allow it to end in chaos. Orders were given for withdrawal, calm, precise, impossible under the circumstances, but necessary nonetheless. His marshals obeyed, leading what remained of the army westward across the Elster River. In the night that followed, as the fighting died away, a single explosion shattered the darkness. One of the bridges had been destroyed too soon, trapping thousands on the far bank. Napoleon, watching from a distance, closed his eyes. There was nothing to be done. The sound echoed across the fields, one last hollow note in the long symphony of his wars. By dawn it was over. The French army, what was left of it, retreated toward France. The fields around Leipzig were littered with broken cannon, torn flags, and the still bodies of men who had come from every nation in Europe. The rivers ran dark with silt and ash. The air hung heavy with silence. In that silence, Napoleon did not rage. He did not weep. He simply looked out across the battlefield, the wide expanse that had once bent to his will, and nodded slightly, as though acknowledging something he had always known. Even the greatest mind, the most perfect plan, could not forever outrun the sheer weight of the world. The Battle of Leipzig would later be called the Battle of Nations, and it was more than a name. It was the turning of history itself, the moment when all of Europe, weary of conquest, rose as one to reclaim its balance. For Napoleon, it was the beginning of the end. His genius, once unmatched, had met the patience of time. That night, as he rode away under a cold, quiet sky, the stars above seemed distant, unchanging, eternal, indifferent to the dreams of men. The fields behind him lay still, and the empire, vast and proud, began to fade, not in fire or thunder, but in the slow exhale of exhaustion. By the spring of 1814, the roads of France were filled once more with soldiers, but this time they were not marching toward distant conquest. They were coming home. The flags they carried were torn and faded, their boots worn through by years of war. The songs that had once filled the air with pride were silent now, replaced by the sound of wheels creaking through mud and the distant echo of church bells in villages untouched by glory. The empire that had stretched from Lisbon to Warsaw was no longer. The map of Europe, which Napoleon had once rearranged with a pen as if it were a game of logic, was now rearranging itself without him. One by one, the nations he had conquered turned their armies toward France. Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Britain, the great coalition that had formed after the disaster of Russia, now pressed into the French heartland. Napoleon moved among his troops with the same calm precision as ever, issuing orders, inspecting lines, calculating. But there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. Not fear, not even despair, but weariness. The stillness of a man who understands that he is nearing the end of his power. He fought as he always had, brilliantly, relentlessly, with sudden strikes and cunning movements. But even his victories now felt small, temporary, like waves breaking against an incoming tide. And Paris, once untouchable, now trembled. In March, the coalition armies reached its gates. For days, the city defended itself bravely, but the numbers were too great. The old generals, the weary conscripts, the loyal guard, they could not hold back the tide forever. On March 31st, the Allies entered Paris. The streets that had once cheered Napoleon's name now stood silent, uncertain. Some wept, some watched in disbelief, others simply bowed their heads and waited for whatever came next. Napoleon was not there. He had been fighting south of the capital, unaware at first that his empire had fallen around him. When he heard the news, he stopped for a long moment, looking down at the ground, his face unreadable. Then he simply said, "So, Paris." He turned his horse and rode toward Fontainebleau, the great palace that had once been a symbol of his strength, and now would become the stage of his surrender. Fontainebleau was quiet in early April. The trees around it were still bare from winter, their branches etched against a pale sky. Inside, the grand halls that had echoed with music and laughter were hushed. Servants spoke in whispers, courtiers avoided one another's eyes. In a small room overlooking the courtyard, Napoleon sat alone at his desk, writing letters to his marshals, his family, his ministers. His handwriting, neat as always, betrayed nothing. Delegates from the coalition soon arrived. They were polite, even respectful, but their purpose was clear. The emperor must abdicate. France would no longer bear his rule. They offered him terms, safe passage, a small sovereignty on the island of Elba, and his title retained in name if not in power. Napoleon listened without interruption. He asked a few questions, practical ones about his family, his guards, his pension. And then, when all was clear, he said softly, "I abdicate." He signed his name at the bottom of the page, the same signature that had once sealed treaties, appointed kings, and redrawn the map of Europe. The pen moved smoothly, almost casually, and then it was done. That night, he walked through the long corridors of the palace. The portraits of past monarchs stared down at him from their gilded frames. He paused before one, Henry IV, the old king of France, smiling eternally from across the centuries, and stood there for a long while. "Better a sword than a crown without power," he murmured, almost to himself. In the courtyard, his Imperial Guard gathered, still loyal, still unbroken in spirit. They had followed him through every campaign, across deserts and mountains, through snow and fire. Now, as the Emperor stepped out to address them, they stood in silence, their faces pale with grief. He wore his familiar grey coat, the one they had seen on battlefields from Austerlitz to Wagram. The wind stirred gently through the trees. "My old comrades," he began, his voice steady but low, "I cannot embrace you all, but I will embrace your general." He stepped forward and took the standard from a grenadier's hand. The eagle atop the flag gleamed faintly in the morning light. "I have sacrificed everything for France," he continued, "and for her glory. Now fortune has turned against me. Be faithful to the new government for the good of our country. Do not grieve my fate. I shall always think of you." And then, in a moment that would be remembered for generations, he pressed the eagle to his lips, kissed it, and turned away. Many of his soldiers wept openly. Others saluted in silence. Napoleon mounted his carriage, and as the wheels began to turn, the guard cried out, not with defiance, not with triumph, but with love. "Vive l'Empereur!" The sound followed him down the long avenue until it faded into the quiet of the forest. He left Fontainebleau as he had once left so many battlefields, with composure. But now there were no armies waiting, no drums, no banners. Only the soft roll of the carriage wheels and the sound of spring rain beginning to fall on the leaves. At each village along the way, people came out to watch. Some knelt, some turned away, a few shouted insults. Most simply watched in silence as the man who had ruled half the world passed by them in exile. Inside the carriage, Napoleon sat still, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Later, when one of his aides asked what he was thinking, he said only, "I have no illusions. I am leaving the world of events for the world of memory." When he reached the southern coast, a small ship waited, L'Inconstante, bound for the island of Elba. As he stepped aboard, he paused once, looking back toward the mainland, toward France. The waves were calm, the air heavy with salt. "They will see me again," he said quietly. And then, with the faintest of smiles, he turned and went below deck. The sails filled, the ship drifted away from the shore, and the man who had been emperor watched the coastline fade into haze. Behind him lay an empire undone, a continent reshaped, and a life that had changed the course of history. Ahead lay a small island, a small court, and the stillness of exile. But even there, the story was not quite finished. The island of Elba lies in the blue heart of the Mediterranean, small and rough-edged, its hills covered in olive trees and low brush, its villages perched like clusters of old stone above the sea. The waves break gently against its shores, and in the morning, mist rises from the valleys, softening the outlines of the world. It was to this quiet place, that Napoleon Bonaparte came in the spring of 1814, not as conqueror or general, but as an exile, the ruler of a kingdom that measured barely a few dozen miles across. When the ship L'Inconstant reached Portoferraio, the harbour was calm. A few fishing boats bobbed in the shallows, their sails like small white wings against the sky. The people of Elba watched from the shore as the Emperor of the French stepped onto their island, his uniform plain, his stride still measured and sure. He bowed slightly to the officials who had come to greet him, then turned his gaze toward the hills, as though measuring the island the way he had once measured empires. He was 44 years old. Behind him lay 2 decades of war and rule, of creation and destruction, of brilliance and exhaustion. Ahead lay quiet, or something that resembled it. The Allies had granted him sovereignty over Elba, and in the careful language of diplomacy, he remained emperor, though now of a realm so small it could be crossed in an afternoon. It was both a kindness and a humiliation, and perhaps the most fitting irony of his life. The man who had rearranged continents now confined to an island small enough to be held in the palm of a map. At first, he threw himself into his new duties, with the same energy he had once given to nations. He reorganized everything. The port was improved, roads repaired, taxes adjusted, schools established. He visited the mines, the farms, the markets, speaking with the islanders in his quiet, deliberate way. They found him courteous, curious, and endlessly practical. Within weeks, the rhythms of Elba began to shift. The roads smoother, the administration more efficient, the air filled once again with the sound of order being imposed upon disorder. He held small audiences each morning, inspected local troops in the afternoons, and dined with his household in the evenings. There were gardens to walk in, letters to write, and visitors to receive. The people of the island, at first uncertain, began to admire him. They called him l'Imperatore, half in awe, half in affection. For a while, it almost seemed that he could make a new life there, smaller, quieter, but still his own. And yet, beneath the surface calm, restlessness stirred. Napoleon was a man built for motion, for problems to solve and worlds to shape. Elba, with its narrow roads and slow days, offered neither. He rode his horse along the island's trails, looking out toward the mainland, where the faint outline of Italy hovered across the water. Sometimes, standing on a cliff at dusk, he would watch the sun sink behind the horizon and imagine the cities beyond. Paris, Vienna, London, still alive with movement, still turning without him. News from France came slowly, but it came. He learned that the new king, Louis XIX, had been restored to the throne. He heard of the return of old courtiers, of the discontent among officers left without purpose, of peasants uncertain of what peace meant now that the wars were over. Each report stirred something deep within him, not anger exactly, but a sense of incompleteness. He had shaped a world, and now it was being reshaped without him. He received visitors, merchants, travelers, a few loyal soldiers who had followed him even here. They brought him letters, gossip, small gifts. Some were discreet, others spoke openly of their disillusionment with the new government. Napoleon listened without expression, but his mind, always in motion, began to turn once more. The island was quiet, but his thoughts were not. He spoke sometimes with his aides of what he might write, a memoir, perhaps, a reflection on leadership and war. But even in these conversations, there was an undercurrent of impatience. "It is strange," he said once, walking along the shore, "how the world continues to need me and yet does not know it." Still, there were moments of peace. He would sit for hours in the garden of his small palace, watching bees drift among the flowers. The air smelled of thyme and sea salt. Sometimes he would speak to the local children who came to watch the soldiers drill, asking them their names, their lessons, their dreams. In those moments, the emperor seemed to vanish, leaving only a man, clever, tired, and human. But the sea has its own kind of whispering, and on quiet nights it carries far. From across the water came rumors of France restless again, of soldiers still loyal to him, of a people who missed the order he had brought. He would sit at his desk long after midnight, reading dispatches by candlelight, the shadows of the flames moving across the papers. His hands, so used to command, would rest on the table, still for once, until at last he folded the letter and looked toward the window. Outside, the stars glittered above the water, the same stars that had shone over his marches, his battles, his coronations. He began to make small preparations. A few ships were repaired and provisioned under vague orders. Loyal officers were given quiet instructions. Letters went out in cautious, discreet. To his attendants he appeared calm, but those who had known him longest could see it, the gathering of purpose. "Elba is too small for me," he said one morning, almost absently as if stating a fact. "France is too large to forget me." Winter passed into spring. The sea grew calmer, the skies clearer. On the evening of February 26th, 1815, as the island slept, Napoleon dressed in his familiar grey coat and stepped aboard one of his small ships, L'Inconstant, the same name as the vessel that had once brought him here. His guards and officers followed without hesitation. The sails filled, the ropes creaked, and the ship slipped quietly out of the harbour, carrying with it the most unlikely of passengers, an emperor returning from exile. He stood at the stern as Elba faded behind him, its hills turning dark against the horizon. The wind touched his hair, the air smelled of salt and freedom. "We are going home," he said softly. And though his words were quiet, every man aboard heard them as a promise. The sea stretched wide before them, vast, calm, eternal. Beyond it lay France, and beyond France destiny once more awakening. When Napoleon's ship left Elba in February of 1815, the sea was calm and the wind light. The horizon stretched in every direction, a faint blue arc between sky and water, and for the first time in many months he felt motion again, the slow rocking of the vessel beneath his feet, the sound of waves against the hull. The night air carried the faint scent of pine from the distant mainland, Above him, stars shone clear and cold, as though the world were holding its breath. The voyage to France took only a few days, but in that short span, history itself seemed to pause. The little flotilla, one ship of war, a few small transports, fewer than 1,000 men, moved quietly across the Mediterranean, unnoticed at first, almost like a ghost. There were no fanfares, no declarations, no armies waiting. Yet within that small ship, the weight of an empire began to stir again. He landed near Cannes on the 1st of March. The beach was empty except for a few fishermen who stared in disbelief as the Emperor of the French stepped ashore, wearing his old grey coat and a bicorn hat, his boots dusty from the sand. There were no crowds to greet him, no soldiers drawn up in salute. Only the wind and the quiet sound of waves. But Napoleon had never needed ceremony. He had always relied on presence, that strange, quiet force that made men believe in him. As he stood on the beach, looking inland toward the dark hills of Provence, he smiled slightly. "We will go to Paris," he said. "The road is open," and so they began to march, a small band of loyal guards, drums silent, eagles glinting faintly in the morning light. They moved north through the countryside, through narrow roads and mountain passes still edged with snow. At first, the towns they passed through were wary. Mayors closed their doors, garrisons hesitated. The name Napoleon was both legend and warning, a name that had once commanded Europe and now was spoken with caution. But as the days passed, the caution began to melt. In Digny, the townspeople came out to watch him ride by. In Sisteron, an old veteran stepped forward and saluted. By the time they reached Grenoble, the first soldiers sent to stop him had joined him instead. It was said that when he faced them on the road, he walked ahead alone, opened his coat and said, "If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." No one fired. Instead, the muskets lowered and the cry went up, "Vive l'Empereur!" From that moment, the march became a pilgrimage. Villages that had seemed indifferent now lined the roads with people cheering. Farmers brought bread and wine, women threw flowers, children ran beside the columns. The army that had been sent to stop him dissolved into his ranks. Each day the line grew longer, from a few hundred to thousands. France was awakening again, not by force, but by memory. By the time he reached Lyon, he commanded an army once more. The city gates opened to him as though he had never left. He spoke to the crowds from the balcony of the prefecture, his voice calm, almost gentle. "There have been misunderstandings," he said, "but France and I are one." The people cheered until the streets echoed. In Paris, the news arrived first as rumor, then as panic. The Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, dismissed it as fantasy. "Bonaparte cannot set foot in France," he said, "without being crushed." But as the reports came faster, Grenoble, Lyon, Auxerre, his confidence faded. On the evening of March 19th, the royal carriage rolled quietly out of the capital. The next day, Napoleon entered Paris. He did not enter as a conqueror. There were no battles, no gunfire, no resistance. The streets were filled with crowds, cheering, weeping, throwing laurel leaves before his horse. The tricolour flags that had been hidden in drawers for a year reappeared from windows and rooftops. The air was thick with the sound of old songs, songs from his first campaigns, from the glory days of the Empire. And when he stepped once more into the Tuileries Palace, the city seemed to exhale. "It is as though he had never left," someone wrote that night. For Napoleon, it was a strange and beautiful return, not of armies, but of belief. The people still loved him. The soldiers still trusted him. And yet, even amid the triumph, he must have felt the fragility of it. The France that welcomed him back was not the France he had ruled. It was poorer, more cautious, more weary. The Europe beyond its borders had already begun to move against him again. Still, for those few months, those 100 days between his return and his final fall, it was as though time had reversed. He worked endlessly, reorganizing government, rewriting laws, rebuilding his army. He promised peace, but peace would not have him. "They will not leave me alone," he said, "unless I strike first." And so once again he prepared for war. In June, he marched north toward Belgium, where British and Prussian armies were gathering under Wellington and Blücher. The old confidence returned, but tempered now with restraint. He was not the man of Austerlitz or Jena, not the young general of dazzling speed, but the seasoned emperor, wary and deliberate. "If I can win one battle," he told his marshals, "one clear victory, Europe will speak to me again." The fields of Waterloo waited. And so the 100 days, which had begun on a quiet shore with a handful of men, ended on a rain-soaked plain where cannon smoke drifted over wheat fields and the sky turned dark with thunder. The world had come full circle. But that story belongs to the next and final chapter, the last act of motion before the long stillness. For now, we leave him in the calm before that final storm, standing in a tent at dawn, a map spread before him, the murmur of aides outside, the faint scent of damp earth in the air. He leans over the map, tracing the lines with his finger, silent and steady, as he had done 1,000 times before. Beyond the canvas walls, the world waits, armies, destinies, and the gentle breath of wind moving through the tall grass of Waterloo. The morning of June 18th, 1815, dawned grey and heavy with rain. Across the low fields of Belgium, near a quiet village called Waterloo, the air was thick with mist. The crops were tall, the ground soft and wet from the storm that had passed in the night. It was Sunday, the kind of day that, in another life, might have been peaceful with church bells and the smell of bread baking in the villages. But this day would belong to history. It would be the last of Napoleon's long march across Europe. He rose early, as was his habit. In his tent, maps were spread across a table, small pins marking the positions of his enemies. The British army under Wellington held the ridge ahead. The Prussians under Blücher were somewhere to the east, marching, unseen but certain. Napoleon moved his hand over the map, tracing the lines with his finger. His expression was calm, almost detached. "If the ground dries," he said quietly, "we will win." Outside, the army waited. Drums were damp, horses restless. Soldiers huddled around small fires, their uniforms streaked with mud. And some talked softly of past victories, Austerlitz, Wagram, Jena, names that felt now like another lifetime. The veterans still believed in him. Even after all the defeats, all the years, they still called him l'Empereur with reverence. They said that when he rode past, the air itself seemed to change. Around 11 o'clock, the cannons began to fire. The thunder rolled across the fields, echoing against the hills. The Battle of Waterloo had begun. At first, the French advanced with confidence. They moved as they always had, disciplined, fearless, steady beneath the rain. Napoleon's strategy was clear: break the center, separate the British from their Prussian allies, and end the campaign before the full weight of Europe could descend upon him. The plan was sound, as his plans always were. But the ground was soft, the cannons sank into the mud, and time itself seemed to resist him. The battle unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the earth itself were weary of war. Waves of men crossed the fields, vanished into smoke, and returned fewer than they had been. At La Haye-Sainte, at Hougoumont, at Papelotte, small names, small places, the fighting was fierce, desperate, personal. The air was filled with the roar of muskets, the crash of cannon, the cries of horses. The rain returned in bursts, washing the blood into the soil. From his position on the rise, Napoleon watched it all through his glass. He gave orders calmly, his mind moving with the same precision it always had. Yet even as he commanded, something in him seemed distant, not uncertain but aware. He could feel the rhythm of the battle slipping beyond his control, as though the great machinery of destiny, which he had once turned with such ease, had begun to move on its own. By mid-afternoon, the Prussians arrived. Their banners appeared like a dark line through the mist, their drums echoing faintly through the gunfire. The French army, already stretched thin, began to bend. Napoleon sent reinforcements, rallied the line, rode among his troops. "Steady, my children," he said softly. "The hour will come," but the hour was passing. As the sun sank low behind the clouds, he called for the Imperial Guard, his last reserve, his most loyal soldiers. They marched forward in perfect silence, faces stern, the eagle standards gleaming above them. For a moment, it seemed as though the old magic might return, as though the will that had carried him from Corsica to the crowns of Europe might rise one last time. The guard advanced into the smoke, muskets raised. They vanished into the storm of gunfire. And then, from somewhere ahead, a shout went up, not of triumph, but of warning. "La Garde recule, the Guard is retreating." It was the first time those words had ever been spoken. The line broke. The army, seeing the Guard fall back, began to falter. Panic spread like wind through dry grass. Horses bolted, drums fell silent. Napoleon tried to rally them, calling out, "The Guard dies, it does not surrender," but the field was already lost. The night closed in, the rain fell harder, and the road to Brussels filled with men retreating into darkness. He rode away quietly without escort, the sound of battle fading behind him. The sky was dark, the road slick beneath the hooves of his horse. He did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The empire, which had begun with a promise of reason and order, had ended in mud and silence. The next day he reached Charleroi. From there, he returned to Paris, not as a conqueror, not even as a ruler, but as a man carrying the weight of his own ending. The city greeted him with confusion and sorrow. Some still believed he could rally again, but Napoleon knew better. "The cause is lost," he said simply. "France will not bleed anymore." He abdicated for the second and final time on June 22nd, 1815. There was no ceremony, no audience of marshals or ministers. Just a signature, quiet and final. He asked for safe passage to America, but the British, cautious and certain, denied it. Instead, they chose another island, far away across oceans and winds, Saint Helena, a small rock in the South Atlantic, where even the horizon would remind him of his solitude. He sailed in July, under guard, aboard the ship Northumberland. As the coast of France faded behind him, he stood on deck, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the sea. Someone asked if he wished to see England. "No," he replied softly. "It would only make me remember what I once was." The voyage was long and quiet. He spent his days walking the deck, reading, speaking little. The sailors watched him from a distance, half in awe, half in pity. To them, he was both legend and man, the conqueror who had shaken the world, now pacing alone beneath the vast, unending sky. When they reached St. Helena in October, the island appeared through the mist, steep, windswept, surrounded by the endless ocean. It was as far from Paris, from Europe, from power as one could go. He lived there for 6 years, in a small house called Longwood, writing, dictating his memoirs, walking among the rocks. The world moved on without him, and yet, in a way, he remained. His ideas, his codes, his legend, they outlived the empire. Even his enemies could not erase him. History, with its long memory, kept his name alive, not for his victories or his crowns, but for the strange and restless light that burned within him, the human desire to shape the world, to hold time still, if only for a moment. In May of 1821, he died quietly in his sleep, as the wind swept over the island and the sea whispered below the cliffs. His last words, they say, were of France, of the people, the army, and a single name that had followed him through every dream: Josephine. And so ended the journey that had begun in the hills of Corsica, passed through the courts of Europe, and ended on a lonely island under the stars. The man who had once ruled the world left it not with a roar, but with a sigh. The waves continued to break against the rocks, gentle and endless. The empire was gone, But the story remained, quiet now, folded into history like a dream half remembered, still moving softly beneath the surface of time.